Hello, everybody. My name is Laura, and yes, I am Dad Aspie. And today's topic for this episode is going to be what autism and the autism spectrum disorder even is. Now, the short answer to this question is it's complicated. And there's a lot of reasons for it being complicated, ranging from how it affects everybody so differently to the fact that this is a spectrum. So that means that there are different points of it that may show different signs or different like ways it manifests itself in somebody's person. The way that the CDC and the DSM-5 classifies autism spectrum disorders is that it is a developmental disability that causes significant social, communication, and behavior challenges. Essentially, folks with an autism spectrum disorder communicate or interact with the world or behave or learn things about what's going on around them in different ways than the average person would. Some of the reasons for that may be because the processing speed that we have is a little slower. We may look at things a little bit differently in the sense that we're more literal minded. We may process more information at the same time and become more prone to being overwhelmed, and a variety of other reasons. Now, when you say autism spectrum disorder, this can also be classified within a couple of different subpoints, such as pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which basically means it's a non-specific part of the autism spectrum where you do meet some of the requirements to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, but nothing specific, hence the not otherwise specified section. These disorders also include Asperger's syndrome, or mild autism as we now know it, and what people may think of as the classic definition of autism spectrum disorder, or just autism, really. This is one of the reasons why we call it a spectrum, because there is a range of things that fall under this umbrella. As far as any of the signs and the symptoms that may present themselves in people with autism spectrum disorders, it kind of depends on the person and how the wiring in them is, but I have a list of the basic ones that you may find with children or adults with an autism spectrum disorder, and I'm going to read those to you right now. So according to the CDC, it is listed that children or adults with an autism spectrum disorder might not point at objects to show interest, for example, not point at an airplane flying over, not look at objects when another person points at them, have trouble relating to others or not have an interest in other people at all, avoid eye contact and want to be alone, have trouble understanding other people's feelings or talking about their own feelings, prefer not to be held or cuddled or might cuddle only when they want to, appear to be unaware when people talk to them but respond to other sounds, be very interested in people but not know how to talk, play, or relate to them, repeat or echo words or phrases said to them or repeat words or phrases in place of normal language, have trouble expressing their needs using typical words or motions, not play pretend games, for example, not pretending to feed a doll, repeat actions over and over again, have trouble adapting when a routine changes, have unusual reactions to the way things smell, taste, look, feel, or sound, lose skills they once had, for example, stop saying words they were using. Now, one of the things that makes this a spectrum is that it's not one of those disorders where you have to tick off, like, every single thing on the list in order to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. It's kind of similar to how, where, say, you're going into bipolar disorder or something, and they have a list of symptoms, and you can classify yourself as relating to at least X number of them. These are all like possibilities that can show depending on the person. So just because you are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder does not mean that all of these things on this list apply to you. So the CDC also lists like diagnostic criteria that I'll read off to you and then try to explain like what the hell that even means. The list that I'm about to read you comes from the American Psychiatric Association and their version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, so that's what I mean when I say the DSM. So one thing that they look for when looking to diagnose somebody with an autism spectrum disorder, as it's read here in the CDC, it says looking for persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifest by the following, currently, or by history. So basically, like, if they've either shown a history of this before, or currently deal with this, or whatever. This includes deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversations to reduce sharing of interests, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. I think what this is saying is that we're not as likely to directly respond to somebody in the way that an average person would in a conversation. The trick with that is that just because we're not directly responding to you doesn't mean we don't hear you and we don't understand you. We just may not always know how to communicate it. Another thing they list in this section is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expression and nonverbal communication. So essentially, we tend to struggle with any of the nonverbal parts of communication, which is kind of funny because I think it's around 30% of communication that we do interpersonally is verbal. The rest of it is like body language, tone, pitch, all sorts of things that don't involve the words that we are actually saying. It like supplements it. At least that's what I believe they're trying to say. The third thing they list with this is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understand relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. Now, the issue I have with that last bit, to absence of interest in peers, that's not always the case. I often find that, at least from the people that I've met, we like interacting with people. It's just so fucking overwhelming sometimes. And also, it's hard when you spend a lot of your time trying to interact with people, but they're not understanding you, or they either just look at you like you're weird and end up making fun of you, and then you deal with that your whole life. So no wonder we don't have any interest in interacting with people if we know all they're gonna do is make fun of us. But that's just my personal opinion on that. What I'm reading off is like what's listed, so that's like the clinical sciencey part of this, if you will. And that's just the basic diagnostic criteria. They go on to say, like, specify severity or whatever. So, like, say it's based on social communication impairments and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. The restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, the word we use for that is stimming. Stimming can also be found in, like, people with ADHD or other mental health disorders. What it basically is like a self-soothing mechanism. So if you notice that, like, there's rocking back and forth, there's bouncing, hand flapping, fidget toys, all that sort of stuff, that's all stimming. It is a repetitive behavior, yes. However, it's a self-soothing thing. So stimming is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people may believe that and try to correct us on that, but that's actually doing us a big disservice and actually making things worse. It's also kind of how I describe how a meltdown happens, but the way that, like, if you imagine a person like a pressure cooker, and when you have a pressure cooker, it's a vacuum where the pressure inside the cooker builds up and up and up and up. Now, in order to regulate that pressure that's happening inside, there's usually some kind of safety valve that, say, if you wanted to set it to a certain pressure, that's the thing that keeps it at that level you want it. It also helps the pressure inside keep from building up way too much, because if that safety valve is blocked, the pressure's going to keep building up inside. And stimming is basically one of the ways that acts as our pressure safety valve. If you block off that safety valve, that pressure cooker becomes a ticking time bomb, and the pressure's just going to keep building and building and building and building, and if there's nothing there to regulate it, it's eventually going to explode. So that's what I mean when I say stimming is basically a safety valve to help us not explode or have a meltdown. I plan to make a video that talks more about what stimming is and, like, why that is the case. I may or may not keep the explanation I've given. I'm not sure yet. I'll look at it in editing. So what they list with the restricted behavior patterns and interests and activities, They say it manifests by at least two of the following things: stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, like lining up toys, flipping objects, like little repetitive things that we may do. Insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. For example, extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, need to take the same route or eat the same food every day. So when they say that, like, humans are naturally creatures of habit, people with an autism spectrum disorder kind of take it to another level. Again, this depends on the person and how severe that need is. The third thing is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, or, for example, strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or preservative interests. That's a word. So the simple term for this is special interests. It's something that our brains tend to hyper-focus on, and we just become, like, low-key obsessed. The fourth thing is hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. For example, apparent indifference to pain, temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascinations with lights or movement. So that's where all the sensory processing thing comes in. Like, there's a lot of times where we may be prone to sensory overload because we're processing, like, all of the things. But there's also times where we kind of tune out some of it, I guess. I'm not sure. There's also times where, like, while some things will set us off as far as our sensory processing goes, there are some things that we get kind of numb to. I don't know what it is. I'm not sure how to explain it. That's something I'd have to think about, and I think I'm doing something about sensory overloads, so I'll get more into detail there. Another way that they can, I guess, like, guess what the severity of it is these couple of things that are listed here. Symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifested until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies later in life. The simple term for that is masking. Some of us who are less severe, and more on the mild end of the spectrum, we become very good at social camouflage. Almost a little too good at it sometimes, and it's actually very goddamn exhausting. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. Again, going back to a lot of that other stuff that was talked about in this video, it can cause a lot of interference on how we live our lives to the way that our society expects us to. These disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or an intellectual developmental disorder or global developmental delay. Intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur to make comorbid diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. Social communication should be below that expected for general developmental level. There's no guarantee that somebody with an autism spectrum disorder also has a learning disability, but it's not entirely uncommon for that to happen. Basically what they're saying is that if all of those things that they were listed cannot be explained by other disorders, like an intellectual disability, then that's how they're able to narrow it down to, oh, it's caused by the autism spectrum disorder. So all of those things that I read off for you, that's just the criteria for diagnosing, like, autism spectrum disorder, like autism specifically. While not everybody may fit, like, all of the expensive lists that I just read, when you go to specific parts of the spectrum, like what we call Asperger's syndrome, PDD, and OS, they may not meet as many of the requirements. One of the things is, like, autism may cause, like, deeper developmental delays in other facets of our lives, not to the level of where the other more specific disorders may affect us. Essentially, it's kind of like those are the more, like, mild cases, I guess, at least from my understanding of it. But that's generally the basic clinical definition of autism spectrum disorder. I know it's a lot of jargon and a lot of, like, big words, but I'm hoping that giving a little bit of my perspective on that might help, at least from, like, what I understand of what's in front of me. I will leave links to these pages down below if you would like to read them for yourselves. Research is important, and for especially this type of thing, you definitely want good resources. Usually for this, the best resources might be the DSM itself, especially the most updated version of the DSM. I'm not sure if it's entirely different in other parts of the world, but the one that I see is listed under the American Psychiatric Association. I'm not sure if this is a global standard or not. I have to look into this again. But I also know that the DSM-5 came about around the early 2010s, and I do remember that happening and how I felt about it at the time, which is something that I will discuss in the future. But that's the basic idea of what it is, and a basic look in some of the terminology that might be used within the autism community surrounding all of this. If there's anything I missed with this in particular, just the basic definition of what an autism spectrum disorder is, please let me know. I will be happy to research that a little bit more, and I would also love to, spread that so I can actually spread actual information, not misinformation. So feel free to let me know if I got any of this wrong, but only if you actually know that I got any of this wrong, because I know that there's all sorts of conflicting things that are out there in the world of the internet, and part of it has to do with different opinions. So I want to look at this like more or less factual, but then offer like my personal look into what that means, at least from what I understand of it. And be on the lookout for future videos that'll cover a range of different topics, but now you have a basic understanding in the wonderful world of an autism spectrum disorder, at least by clinical standards. Mayhaps. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that everyone has a lovely day. And until next time, take care, everyone. Bye!